What if I told you that the man who would become America's greatest president once chopped wood for 25 cents a day, slept on a dirt floor, and taught himself to read by candlelight? Abraham Lincoln's journey from absolute poverty to the White House is so incredible. It sounds like fiction. But by the end of this video, you'll discover the shocking moment that almost ended his presidency before it began, and the one decision that changed the course of American history forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready to be amazed, subscribe for more incredible historical stories, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Abraham Lincoln's story begins in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky that was so small you could barely fit a modern-day bathroom inside it. The floor? Pouredift. No windows, no proper door, just gaps between the logs that let in freezing wind during winter. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was what you'd call a struggling farmer who moved the family constantly, always chasing the hope of better land, better opportunities. They were so poor that young Abraham wore clothes made from deerskin and went barefoot, even in winter. But here's where it gets interesting. While other children his age were playing, Abraham was already working like a grown man. By age 7, he was handling an axe. By 10, he could split rails and clear fields. His hands were calloused and bleeding before he even reached his teens. The family moved to Indiana when Abraham was 7. And this is where tragedy first struck. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was just 9 years old. But what she left him would change everything. She had taught him the alphabet and basic reading. In a world where most people couldn't even write their own names, this was like giving him a superpower. But Lincoln's real transformation was still years away, and it would come from the most unexpected source. Picture this: a tall, awkward teenager walking miles through dense forest just to borrow a book. Lincoln owned fewer than 10 books in his entire childhood, but he read each one dozens of times until he had memorized entire passages. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, encouraged his reading, but his father thought it was a waste of time. Thomas Lincoln would actually destroy Abraham's books if he caught him reading during work hours. This created a tension that would define Lincoln's entire youth. The constant battle between the life his father wanted for him and the life he desperately wanted for himself. Here's something most people don't know. Lincoln was entirely self-taught in mathematics, grammar, and law. He never spent a full year in school in his entire life. His total formal education? Less than 12 months combined. Yet he became a master of language and logic through pure determination. The young Lincoln would walk 20 miles just to hear a traveling preacher speak. Not for religion, but to study how the man used words to move people. He practiced giving speeches to trees in the forest, imagining himself addressing crowds. But there was one book that would completely change his destiny, and when you hear what it was, everything about Lincoln's later life will make perfect sense. At age 23, Lincoln encountered The Life of George Washington by Mason Weems. This wasn't just any biography. It painted Washington as a common man who rose to greatness through virtue and determination. For a young man from a dirt floor cabin, this was revolutionary thinking. This book planted a seed. If Washington could rise from humble beginnings to lead a nation, why couldn't Abraham Lincoln? In 1830, the Lincoln family made their final move to Illinois. Abraham was 21 and legally free to leave his family. This was his moment of decision. He could stay and live the hard, simple life of a frontier farmer like his father, or he could venture into the unknown and try to make something of himself. He chose the unknown. Lincoln moved to New Salem, Illinois, a tiny village of about 100 people. He worked as a store clerk, postmaster, and surveyor. But here's the crucial part. He announced his intention to study law. People laughed. A poor, uneducated rail splitter becoming a lawyer? It seemed impossible. But Lincoln had a secret weapon that would shock everyone who underestimated him, and it would make him one of the most feared debaters in all of Illinois. Lincoln taught himself law by borrowing legal books and reading them by firelight. He would walk miles to attend court sessions, just to watch real lawyers in action. He studied their arguments, their mannerisms, their techniques. When he finally became licensed to practice law in 1836, something extraordinary happened. This awkward, poorly dressed man from nowhere became legendary for his ability to present complex arguments in simple, powerful language that anyone could understand. But here's what made Lincoln truly dangerous in court. He had an almost supernatural ability to find the one crucial flaw in his opponent's case. Other lawyers would present elaborate arguments filled with legal jargon. Lincoln would stand up, tell a simple story that everyone could relate to, and destroy their entire position in minutes. His reputation grew rapidly. He became known as Honest Abe because he would actually refuse cases if he believed his client was in the wrong. In a profession known for moral flexibility, this honesty made him stand out like a beacon. Lincoln also entered politics, serving in the Illinois House of Representatives. But it was his debates and speeches that began attracting attention far beyond Illinois. However, Lincoln's rise wasn't without devastating setbacks. There was one period where he nearly gave up everything, and the reason why will surprise you. In 1835, Lincoln fell deeply in love with Anne Rutledge, a young woman in New Salem. They were engaged to be married, then and died suddenly of typhoid fever. Lincoln was so devastated that friends worried he might take his own life. He disappeared into the wilderness for days, talking to no one. This wasn't just heartbreak, it was a complete crisis of faith. For the first time, Lincoln questioned whether his dreams were worth pursuing. He had lost the woman he loved, he was still poor, and his political career was going nowhere. But from this darkness came an unexpected strength. Lincoln developed what he called his doctrine of necessity, the belief that everything happens for a reason and that we must accept our struggles as preparation for something greater. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. This marriage brought Lincoln into Springfield social circles, but it also brought new pressures. Mary had expensive tastes and high social ambitions. Lincoln needed to succeed not just for himself anymore, but to provide the life his wife expected. This pressure would drive Lincoln to take on the most dangerous political fight of his career, one that would make him famous across the entire nation, but also put his life at risk. In 1858, Lincoln decided to challenge Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois. Douglas was a powerful, well-established politician known as the Little Giant. Lincoln was still seen as a prairie lawyer who was punching above his weight. What happened next changed American history. The Lincoln-Douglas debates became the most famous political debates in American history. But here's what made them extraordinary. They weren't about personal attacks or political tactics. They were about the fundamental question of whether slavery should expand into new territories. Lincoln's position was clear and radical for its time. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot permanently endure half slave and half free. Douglas argued for popular sovereignty, letting each territory decide for itself. It sounded reasonable, but Lincoln exposed the moral bankruptcy of this position with devastating clarity. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, these debates made him a national figure. Newspapers across the country reprinted his speeches. Republican leaders began to see him as presidential material. But Lincoln's path to the presidency would require navigating the most dangerous political crisis in American history, and one wrong move could have ended the United States as we know it. The 1860 Republican Convention was held in Chicago, and Lincoln was considered a long shot. The favorites were William Seward and Salmon P. Chase, both more experienced and better known. But Lincoln's team was brilliant. They packed the convention hall with Lincoln supporters and positioned him as the moderate candidate who could win crucial swing states. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter from Illinois, won the Republican nomination for president. His election victory was even more unlikely. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote in a four-way race. But here's the shocking part. His name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. He won the presidency without receiving a single vote from nearly a third of the country. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Before Lincoln even took office, 7 states had seceded from the Union. The country was literally falling apart, and he hadn't even been inaugurated yet. Lincoln's first presidential decision would determine whether the United States survived or died, and the pressure he faced would have broken most men. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, under the protection of sharpshooters positioned on nearby rooftops. There were credible threats on his life, and the very ceremony had to be held under military guard. His inaugural address was a masterpiece of diplomacy and firmness. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But words weren't enough. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun, and Lincoln faced a choice that would define his presidency: fight to preserve the Union, or let the country split apart peacefully. Lincoln chose to fight, but here's what most people don't understand. He didn't start the war to free the slaves. His initial goal was purely to preserve the Union. He famously wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." But as the war progressed and the casualties mounted, with over 600,000 Americans eventually dying, Lincoln began to see that this conflict was about something much larger than preserving political unity. The moment when Lincoln finally decided to free the slaves would come under the most desperate circumstances, when the Union was on the brink of losing the war. By 1862, the Civil War was going badly for the Union. The Confederate Army had won several major battles. European powers were considering recognizing the Confederacy, and Northern morale was collapsing. Lincoln realized he needed to transform the war from a fight about political unity into a moral crusade about human freedom. This would make it impossible for European powers to support the Confederacy and would give Union soldiers something greater to fight for. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in rebellious states. It was a stroke of political genius and moral courage combined. With one signature, he changed a civil war into a war for human liberation. But here's the irony. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free a single slave on the day it was signed, because it only applied to areas still in rebellion. Lincoln knew this, but he also knew that as Union armies advanced, freedom would follow. The proclamation transformed not just the war, but Lincoln himself. The prairie lawyer who had once been willing to preserve slavery to save the Union had become the great emancipator. But Lincoln's greatest speech, the one that would define America forever, was still to come, and it would last less than 3 minutes. On November 19th, 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a cemetery for soldiers killed in the war's bloodiest battle. He was not the main speaker. That honor went to Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln's speech lasted less than 3 minutes, just 272 words. Many in the audience were disappointed by its brevity. Some newspapers criticized it as inadequate for such a solemn occasion. But the Gettysburg Address became the most important speech in American history. In just 10 sentences, Lincoln redefined what America meant. He transformed the nation from a political experiment into a sacred cause, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. This wasn't just beautiful rhetoric. It was a complete reimagining of American democracy. Lincoln took the founding fathers' vision and expanded it to include all people, regardless of race or background. Lincoln's final triumph would come just as victory was within reach, but it would also lead to the tragic moment that cut short one of history's greatest lives. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Richmond fell and Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The Civil War was effectively over. Lincoln was at the peak of his power and popularity. He had preserved the Union, freed the slaves, and proven that democracy could survive its greatest test. His approval ratings were the highest of his presidency. But Lincoln was already thinking beyond victory. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks earlier, had set the tone for Reconstruction. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. He wanted to heal the country, not punish the South. This made him enemies among radical Republicans who wanted harsh retribution against the former Confederacy. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. He was relaxed and happy, enjoying a rare moment of peace after 4 years of unimaginable stress. At 10:15 p.m., actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning at 7:22 a.m., just days after achieving his greatest triumph. But Lincoln's death would accomplish something that his life couldn't, and it would ensure his transformation from president to legend. Abraham Lincoln's assassination transformed him from a controversial president into a martyred saint. The man who had been criticized, mocked, and threatened throughout his presidency suddenly became the savior of the Union and the great emancipator. His funeral train traveled 1,700 miles from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, stopping in cities along the way. Millions of Americans lined the tracks to pay their respects. It was the largest public mourning in American history up to that point. But here's the remarkable thing. Lincoln's death gave him something that very few historical figures achieve: the ability to inspire people across all political and racial lines. He became a symbol that could be claimed by everyone: Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives, Americans of all backgrounds. The rail splitter from Kentucky who had slept on a dirt floor became the face on Mount Rushmore, the Lincoln Memorial, and the $5 bill. More books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than any other American except George Washington. From a one-room log cabin to the White House, from splitting rails to splitting a nation and putting it back together, Abraham Lincoln's life proves that in America, the most unlikely person can rise to meet the greatest challenges. What aspect of Lincoln's incredible journey inspired you the most? Was it his determination to educate himself despite having no formal schooling? His rise from absolute poverty to the presidency? Or perhaps his transformation from a pragmatic politician into the great emancipator? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed me while researching it, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you more incredible stories from history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. We dive deep into the most fascinating stories of people who changed the world, often starting from the most humble beginnings. And if you enjoyed learning about Lincoln's remarkable journey, you'll love our next video about another president who overcame incredible odds.